There are places on Earth that feel like they belong to us. You can find them on a map and drive there. You can call for help if something goes wrong. And then there are places where it doesn't matter how much you've prepared or how experienced you are. Places that seem to consume everyone who enters. One of those places was known as the Nahanni Valley. Welcome back to Legends May Live, where we explore the strange, the mysterious, and the downright eerie. I haven't uploaded a new episode for a while, and for that, I apologize. I've been working on opening up my new gym, ProFit. Hopefully, I'll be back on a more consistent routine now, though. As always, before we hop into today's story, just a quick note. We do our best to stick to the facts, but sometimes accounts don't match up and some details get lost or skewed with time. Also, it's highly likely that I will completely butcher some of the names and pronunciations, so just take this as entertainment. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the northern wilderness wasn't a destination. People didn't head north for vacation or to see the Great Lakes or to just go for a hike. In fact, most men traveling into far north weren't even doing so for the sake of adventure. Instead, they were going for one reason: to bring back something valuable enough to justify the risk. Namely, to stake claims, mine gold, gather furs, things like that. And in those times, not coming back was a serious concern, even if you were extremely experienced in the wilderness. This was way before cell phones and GPS. If you got lost or injured, no one really knew where to look. There were maps, but most were only crude and hand drawings, and in the unpopulated wilderness trek, your last known location could be hundreds of miles off from where you really were. And if you told your friends or family where to expect you and when to expect you to return, even if they got a hold of a map, your exact route might exist only in your own head, with the only person who could fully explain it being yourself. And so the danger was very real. But one of those locations that many people went to was the Nahanni region. And it's beautiful in the way that a cliff's edge is beautiful. It's stunning but not friendly. The valley is carved by the southern Nahanni River, a twisting, violent system that cuts through the limestone and granite. It's filled with tall canyons that cast deep shadows. There are stretches of river that look calm, but if the current grabs your boat, it'll spin it like a toy. There are also deep caves hidden in the cliffs and forests that are easy to get lost in, and they swallow sound. And there's also the creatures that take shelter in them that you have to worry about. And then there's the weather. Weather in the Nahanni changes in a flash. A clear sky can become sleet in an hour, or a warm afternoon can become dangerously cold at night. And in these times, it was already known as a place where men went in and didn't come out. But it wasn't only the land that scared people. It's what the people who lived near it had been saying for generations. The Dene people knew the Nahanni as a place with rules. They had names for the parts of the land that the outsiders just didn't understand. One of the most famous is the Nachitso, often translated as the River of the Giant. And even if you strip away all the supernatural interpretations and try to make it modern, the phrase still lands with weight because it carries a message that there's something here that's bigger than you and dangerous. The warnings the Dene gave, depending on who you ask, were pretty direct. Don't camp in certain places, don't travel alone, don't follow certain tracks, and don't go deeper than you need to. Above all, if you start to feel watched, if the forest gets quiet, or if the air feels heavy, leave immediately. Because the Nahanni doesn't always announce itself with a storm. Sometimes it announces itself with silence. Even though Nahanni had a reputation for being deadly, there were still men who went in knowing full well the danger. And they weren't thrill seekers or just guys trying to prove something. Many were hardened, practical, and experienced people. And they were men who knew how to read weather, how to build shelter in snow, how to hunt, track, and just basically everything you need to know to thrive out in dangerous territory. And these were men who knew what it meant to carry fear and keep moving anyway. But there's a particular kind of confidence that grows in people who've survived the wilderness. It's not arrogance, it's more like proof that they know what they're doing, sort of a proof that they're different from those who tried and didn't make it. And in the late 1800s, there began to be rumors spreading that there were these huge deposits of gold deep in the Nahanni Valley just waiting for someone brave enough to go in and prospect. And at first, people heard that. They were like, okay, that's great, but that's a dangerous area. We really shouldn't go there. But after a while, the idea of all this gold just sitting there waiting to be picked up, dug out, or panned out of the rivers, it just began to be too much. It's like if you knew there was a suitcase filled with thousands upon thousands of dollars, or rather, hundreds of those suitcases, and all you had to do was go get them. Eventually, your mind is going to rationalize the danger. It's just nature, after all. Every town was surrounded by nature. Weather gets bad, that's what shelters are for. Someone must have made it back to tell of the gold, so it can't really be as bad as they say. And eventually, after rolling it around in their heads, the danger really felt manageable, and soon men started picking up and heading for the Nahanni. And the men who entered were those veterans of hard country. They were the men who had crossed frozen rivers, who had buried friends under mounds of stone, and who knew the cost of mistakes. They traveled light, but not careless. They brought their rifles for hunting and protection, axes to build shelter, among other sparse supplies. More importantly, they didn't go alone. They knew it was much safer to travel in pairs, at least. They followed the river, set up camps, left markers so they could find their way back, and for a while nothing happened. The first men didn't vanish in dramatic ways, they just stopped showing up. A prospector fails to return to a trading post, another misses a planned rendezvous downriver. At first, this really isn't anything to worry about because delays happen, weather changes plans, and men choose to stay longer when they strike promising ground. But weeks pass, and then months. And when people finally go looking, they don't find bodies. They find something that's really hard to make sense of. They find a campfire ring with cold ash, a tent collapsed under snow, boot prints that led toward the river and then just end abruptly. There's no signs of struggle, there's no blood, there's no obvious reason why someone would abandon shelter and supplies. So searchers followed the tracks, but eventually they have to stop. Not because the trail ends necessarily, but because something about it is just so eerie. They can't bring themselves to keep going. They feel like they're being watched, pursued even, and there's just this heavy dread over all of them. So they call off the search and go home. In 1908, in spite of its history, two brothers named Frank and Willie McLeod entered the Nahanni Valley. And they knew it was a treacherous place, but they thought that the hype was kind of just rumors blown out of proportion. They weren't thrill seekers or anything like that. They were just two practical men looking to make a living the only way they knew how. And so once they got to the valley, they found what seemed like a good spot and started setting up. They built a small cabin near the river, and inside it they stored months' worth of flour, tools, ammunition, among other supplies. They intended to stay there until winter, and at first, things seemed to be going pretty well. People saw the brothers early in the season, and they were doing just fine, thriving even. But when winter came, the brothers didn't come back. At first, this was really no big deal. Travel in and out of the Nahanni was slow and unpredictable, so everyone just thought that the guys kind of decided to stick it out through the winter and come back when travel was easier. But when spring arrived and no word came, concern started to grow. In the tight-knit, smaller communities, it was easy to notice when someone was missing. Everyone knew everyone else, and so friends, family, and neighbors sent out a small search party. They followed what they thought was the brothers' most likely route, best they could, and eventually they made their way upriver. And sure enough, not far into the valley, they saw a small cabin and knew right away that they had found the brothers' camp. Now, the search party was thrilled that they had found the cabin, but that just raised more questions. Why didn't the men return? Was one injured? Or maybe they both injured? Or had an animal broken in and attacked them? But either way, they continued on, and as they got closer to the cabin, they would see that it was in great shape. Nothing had been broken. They pushed open the door and called out, but there was no answer. And as the door swung open, right away what they could see was that everything was nice and in order inside. No signs of obvious struggle had happened. Supplies were stacked neatly, tools were in place. But once the door swung all the way open and searchers stepped inside, they knew exactly why the brothers hadn't returned. They were both lying on the floor, lifeless. They weren't torn apart by animals. In fact, there were no cuts on their bodies, no signs of self-defense. But their deaths were obviously not an accident, because one blaringly obvious thing they had in common was both men were missing their heads. The cuts were clean and deliberate, yet there was no blood that might indicate where the heads had been taken. There was no trail. And while the horrified searchers did take some time to try to piece together what had happened and find the heads, they were nowhere to be found. Not in the river, near the cabin, anything. They were just gone. And whatever happened to these men had no real explanation. It wasn't over supplies, nothing had been taken. Either way, there were no answers to be found. And so eventually the searchers just had to go back home and deliver the news. And that news spread fast. And with it came a realization that maybe the disappearances through the years weren't accidents, but maybe they were deliberate like this. In the years that followed, prospectors continued to go into the Nahanni, and more cabins were found empty, more camps abandoned mid-task, more men vanished. And by the time word of the headless bodies spread, the Nahanni had earned a new name. Eerily enough, not from folklore, but from experience, they called it the Valley of the Headless Men. It was no longer just dangerous. There was something out there purposely killing. And yet, despite everything, some men still went in. Now, not everyone who entered the Nahanni died. That fact alone complicates the story, because if the valley simply killed people, then survival would be a matter of luck. But the men who came back didn't describe luck. They told it like they were being spared. The survivors didn't arrive back in town bragging that they made it. They didn't tell exaggerated stories over drinks. Most of them really didn't want to talk about it at all. And those who would talk refused to give details or gave just enough to make people uncomfortable. And they came back broken, hardly able to sleep, and avoiding the wilderness at all costs. They were jumpy, flinching at snapped twigs, wind through the trees, or the sound of water splashing over stones. And the ones that would talk, when pressed with the obvious question of, "Why did you leave?" their answers rarely match, but they did all say the same thing in different ways. Something was out there. Of the few that would tell just a bit of their stories, one man said that he woke in the middle of the night to footsteps circling his camp. They were measured and calm, and it sounded like 2 feet, not an animal. He stayed perfectly still inside his tent. He had his rifle in his hands. He was counting the steps as they passed, and they went around once, and then they passed a second time before stopping directly behind his head. And he never heard them leave, but when he got up the next morning, no one was there. Another prospector said that he heard something wading through the river upstream, and then it just stopped suddenly. Another man described waking to silence so complete it felt fake. There were no birds, no frogs, insects, just no sound of wind or water. He said the forest felt like it was holding its breath. And that's when he packed up and left, just abandoning supplies he would have fought for weeks earlier. Because, like all the other men, he left feeling this overwhelming sense of doom. Like something was watching him, and he wasn't likely to make it out alive if he stuck around. And what's striking about these accounts is what's missing. No one described being chased or attacked. Instead, they talked about it like they were being watched and evaluated. Several survivors later said the same unsettling thing, that they felt like prey until they didn't. Like some outside decision had been made. Stay, and something will happen. Leave, and you'll be allowed to go. Stranger still, some men returned to their camps after short scouting trips to find things changed. Their tools had been moved and stacked neatly. Their rifles weren't where they had been left. Food supplies would be untouched but repositioned. One prospector said it felt like someone had walked through his camp slowly, just taking their time to understand how everything worked. And it was almost like it was leaving him a message, like it was trying to say, I was here. I could have stayed. And that prospector left the valley the very next day. For the Dene people, none of this was surprising. They didn't describe the valley as evil, they described it as guarded. To them, it was a place with boundaries. It was a land that tolerated respect and punished intrusion. In some interpretations, the giants of the valley weren't monsters, but more like custodians, protectors of something deeper in the land that wasn't meant to be disturbed. They believed that the decapitation aspect, horrific as it is, wasn't random violence, but it was symbolic, a way of saying, you came too far, you didn't listen, now others will. Eventually, the region that once swallowed men quietly was given a new designation, protection. The Nahanni became part of what is now Nahanni National Park Reserve. And to visit Nahanni, permits are required and routes are controlled. Modern travelers do arrive with GPS units, satellite phones, emergency beacons. It feels like a safe adventure, and yet, even now, reports emerge that feel uncomfortably familiar. Expeditions abandoning routes early, electronics failing without explanation, a sudden overwhelming sense of dread that can't be traced to weather or terrain or anything really explainable. Thankfully, these days no one really disappears or is decapitated, but often people leave without finishing what they came to do. Over the years, many explanations have been proposed, but despite decades of searching, no heads were ever recovered, and the tools that made those clean cuts to sever the men's heads, they were never identified. No definitive explanation has ever tied every case together. And the bodies that were found didn't escalate. There was no evolution, no increased brutality. This was destined to be a cold case from the start. There was a pattern, but it didn't really match what you see in serial killers. And there was no evidence to lead anywhere. And there's a temptation when stories like this survive for generations to treat them as relics, just a scary story from a harsher time. But the Nahanni still exists with its same unforgiving terrain and eerie atmosphere, along with the same heavy feelings that make you feel like you're moments from disaster. The valley hasn't softened. Only our belief that we can control it has grown stronger. But the Valley of Headless Men doesn't need new victims. It already has its name, and it earned it. In truth, we may never know what happened to those men. And that's it for today's episode of Legends May Live. If you enjoyed today's story, please remember to like, subscribe, and share it with a friend who likes the dark and mysterious. Until next time, stay vigilant, keep watch, and keep a good head on your shoulders because legends may live.